Hello on this beautiful April morning. I am Kimberly with So Sassy Stitcher, and I promised you guys a binding video that covered hand stitching the binding on. So that is what I'm going to show you today. So I have my thread here. I have a pretty long piece of thread, and then on the other end from my needle I have just the single thread. So I'm not using a double thread here. It's just going to be a single thread. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to knot my thread. So the easiest way that I learned was just to wrap it around my finger, and then you roll it. See if I can get it to work here for me. Roll it, and then you kind of get this twist in it, and then you bring your finger, your nail, and you pull it down, and you end up with a knot at the end of your thread. So I have my quilt here, and I stitched the binding on using my machine onto the front. Okay, and then I went around the entire quilt and I folded it over so that my folded edge is coming around on the back. So this is the folded edge of that binding. And I have used my little quick clips here to clip it into place so that it holds it, so that I'm not fighting against that while I am stitching. The needle that I have is a fairly short needle. It's about 1.5 inches long. It is sharp on the end. It's not a blunt one, with a relatively small eye, but I don't want it too small so that I can actually get my thread through. So it's just a basic sewing needle. Now, when I start my stitch, doesn't matter where I start. I'm actually going to start closer to a corner so that you can see how to do the corners. So what I'm going to do is I am going to just come through, and you can see I barely have, I'm just a few thread widths in from the edge of that fold. I'm going to make sure that my knot gets tucked in. Now, there's probably 100 different ways that you can stitch this. This is a stitch that was shown to me by somebody who had quilted for a long time, does some beautiful quilts, and so that's what I'm going to show you. So once you have your thread coming up through your binding, I'm going to come down exactly right there where I went in, but I'm going to be into the backing this time, okay? And my needle's going to go in, and I'm going to stitch through the backing, and I want to be on the quilt side of that stitching for putting the binding on. And I'm going to stitch about 1/4 inch. I'm going to come up through the backing and through my binding like that, okay? And I'm going to pull that through, making sure that I don't loop it around my clip. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go back through through the backing fabric. And this one is actually a little bit easier because this one, and then I'm going to come up through the back and the binding and do that same stitch. And this creates a blind stitch, okay? You can, if you look close, you might be able to see a little bit right here. So that's why I'm using a blue thread to match the binding, because that's where I'm going to see, if I have any threads that show, that's where I'm going to see it, okay? This is actually a pillow cover. So this backing doesn't have any quilting on it. If you have quilting that you are trying to sew through, it can be a little bit more challenging because it creates extra resistance, and it's more difficult to keep your thread on the within the sandwich of the quilt and not going onto the front of the quilt. You don't want to see those stitches on the front of your quilt. So then as I go along here, then after about 3 or 4 stitches, I'm going to do a locking stitch. And all that means is I'm going to go into the backing fabric right there where I came up, but instead of stitching a 1/4 inch, I'm going to come right back up through where I am in that same spot and create a locking stitch. That way, if something clips that or catches that thread and cuts it, then it's not going to unravel the whole thing. I'm going to have, it's going to be about 1 inch or so that might unravel that you have to resew versus the whole quilt or a whole side or things like that. So I'm just going to go along repeating that same thing. So you go in on the backing fabric right where you came out on the binding, stitch about a 1/4 inch, come up through the edge of the binding, and I'm keeping this right on the edge of the binding. I'm only grabbing a few threads in for that binding. And then I'm going to throw another locking stitch in, and then I'm going to keep going here until I get to the corner. I've got about 2 to 3 inches here, so it won't take long to get this. And the more underneath the edge of that binding I do, the less you're gonna see. Okay, so you want to keep those stitches nice and small, and you don't want to move over one direction or the other from where you came up. I want to come down so that that stitch is nice and small, nice and straight. And I'm going to do that all the way to the corner. I'm going to give myself one more locking stitch here. Before I get to the corner. I always do a locking stitch at the corner, and it just helps hold that corner a little bit better. Okay, sometimes you'll get some knots in your thread. It just gets a little wily. You can always use a wax product or something that thread keeper, things like that, that will help decrease that knotting issue. I've never used it. I just deal with my knots. It's generally not too big of an issue. If it's wanting to twist and knot a lot, I will let it untwist, hold it up so that the thread can untwist. But knots when you're sewing are just a part of life, and we deal with them. And of course, I'm old enough now that a set of magnifying glasses don't go amiss to be able to see what I'm doing. And even if you're not old and you're doing this, sometimes a pair of magnifying glasses is good because those knots are really, really tiny, and then you can actually see where you need to put your needle to pull that out without having to cut your thread. Okay, so you can see that I have my mitered corner here. So I'm going to do one more stitch before I get to the corner. All right, so now my next stitch, I'm going to put into that mitered corner of my binding. And then I'm going to do a locking stitch right there as well. Now, if you didn't have this just right, I might even throw in another locking stitch right here on this side. If I had trouble catching both corners, I'm going to throw in another locking stitch right there so that I have grabbed, and I make sure that both sides of this mitered corner are attached well so that I don't get any pull up right there. Then I'm just going to keep going around this corner, doing the same exact thing that I did to get to the corner. And if you're left-handed, you're going to be opposite of what I'm doing, and you're probably going to go the other way. Doesn't really make a difference. Okay. Just make sure that if you get, you know, a little knot in there or a little loop, make sure that you get that out so you don't end up with loops in your stitching. So if you're at about a 1/4 inch, you're going to have about 4 stitches per inch. I'm generally a little bit wider than that. I generally have about 3 to 3.5 stitches per inch. Doesn't really matter. You don't want to make them really big, but you don't have to make them really small either. You know, I don't want them a 1/2 inch each one. So that average of a 1/4 inch is going to work well for you. So now I am, you know, a little bit over an inch from that corner. I'm going to throw another locking stitch in here. And then I'm just going to do that all the way around my quilt. It does take a while to hand stitch this, okay, especially if you get a lot of knots in your thread like this one is wanting to do, things like that. It's going to take time. So this one is just a quick pillow cover. It's a bench pillow, so it's long and narrow. So it'll probably take me about an hour to hand stitch this. A big 100 square inch quilt will take me probably about 6 to 8 hours to do. And I generally put movies on, and one movie gets me through about a 1/4 of the quilt. Again, it depends on how much quilting up to the edge there is. You know, if I have custom quilted it and I don't have a lot of quilting right on the edge, it tends to go a little bit faster. If I have done a pantograph that goes clear out the edges and I'm fighting with a lot of stitching right next to it, it's going to go a little bit slower because I want to make sure that those stitches don't pop through to the front. So I hope this helps you when you finish a thread or finish the whole binding. Make sure that you tie it off and lock it up. You know, do a locking stitch before you tie it off, and that should keep your stitches in your binding very well. I really have never, using this method, I have never had problems with a binding coming out. Or the stitching coming out. Even with washings, even with use, I do use my quilts. They're not just for decoration. I've never had an issue with the binding coming off, even in a short little section. So this method has worked really well for me. It gets it nice and tight against it. So I hope this helps you if you want to hand stitch your binding so that you don't have that stitching line there, and then it's a little bit cleaner. It's that invisible line across there. My husband's grandfather, I did a quilt for him one time, and I got it finished and I sent it to him, and he was just amazed at how I was able to get that piece on and not have any stitches show it. He was just so impressed by that. So this does finish them up a little bit cleaner than using your machine to stitch them on, but it is a little bit more time consuming. Hope this helps you finish up those quilts, and happy quilting. Have a fantastic spring day.